Welcome back, everyone, to the latest episode of Deep Dive. I speak vernacular because sometimes the issues are about the Philippines, but of course, as everyone who follows our little podcast knows, that we also have our global engagement with leading experts all around the world. This is the latest installation of this series of fantastic discussion we're having. Shout out to folks at Foreign Affairs with fantastic contributors to the magazine, and of course, today we have another good friend of ours, Dr. Lindsey Ford, with us who served previously in very senior positions in the Biden administration. She's currently the senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in America, but previously was senior director for South Asia at the National Security Council from 2024 to 2025, and was U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia from 2021 to 2024. Of course, today, Lindsey, we're going to focus on your fantastic co-authored piece at Foreign Affairs, the new Eurasian Order. America must link its Atlantic and Pacific strategies. Sorry for that. It was a long day. I was just doing a lot of stat and maths a while ago, so I'm making a transition.
You got it all.
Fantastic. It's lovely to have you here because we just had Eli earlier this year to discuss about kind of a I call it Asian NATO. He talked about the Pacific Alliance. This is perfect because you're looking at now in this entwinement of the geopolitical, I would say, dynamics in Europe and also in Asia. Just earlier this year, I was in Poland and we were joking or bitterly joking with our Polish friends that, Philippines and Poland were just separated by two countries, Russia and China, and now we're de facto neighbors, right? Obviously, that has a lot of operational reality to it, but it's a kind of conversation that a lot of us frontline US allies are having together. So I think that's a perfect segue because I want to get your point of view. What do you mean by this kind of Eurasian order? Because it sounds very Alexander Dugin-ish. No, no, but I know where you're coming from. Can you explain to us where is this coming from, and to what degree was this shaped by your own experience serving in the Biden administration, which was, like, fighting fires in multiple regions at the same time?
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard, and thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here and to see you. So this piece, I think, essentially makes the argument that for most of the Cold War, the United States thought about its security interest and the security environment in Europe and Asia as very distinct from each other, and indeed actually actively worked to keep the European theater and the Asian theater distinct from each other. But that as we are seeing greater alignment between China and Russia, that is no longer possible, and that U.S. strategy needs to update. And in a sense, the United States and its allies are putting themselves at a disadvantage by allowing adversarial nations to share technologies, best practices, to work together to create instability across both Europe and Asia, and not have U.S. allies do the same thing. And so we are essentially saying that the Biden administration put a great emphasis on trying to encourage European allies to pay attention to what was going on in Asia and think about how it would impact their own security, as well as having Asian allies think about the way that impacts in Ukraine and Europe could impact them. So we think that the Trump administration has walked that back a bit, and we're essentially advocating for why we believe that cross-regional allied cooperation is incredibly important.
Yeah, before I go to I don't know, they call it CRINC nowadays, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever you want to call it, that alliance or axis. Before going there, I just want to ask you, and you discussed this very well also in your piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, like why did we have that kind of bifurcation? Was that a contingent outcome of Second World War? Because the way we look at it in Asia is in the transatlantic world, the Second World War was over. But actually in Asia, we still have legacy of Cold War with us. I mean, I've been in South and North Korea. That war is still not over, right? Taiwan and China are still in a kind of a frozen war. So the legacy of Cold War is still very much alive in Asia in ways it is not in Europe. But from the American perspective, why did you have this kind of bifurcation of the European transatlantic strategy from the more trans-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think there's two things here. So one, U.S. strategists for a very long time thought that both Europe and Asia were the two most important theaters for the United States. I think that broadly remains true, though we can maybe quibble about and talk about the degree to which the Western Hemisphere has now become a new priority theater for the United States. But I think most folks would say Europe and Asia remain the most important. And that the idea that you could have any two powers come together would increase the risk that you could have a hegemon that had the ability to undermine and impact US interest across Europe and Asia. And so really what you saw in the Cold War, the effort that the Nixon administration and others made to drive a wedge between China and Russia was exactly this idea that you didn't want those two powers coming closely together and being able to create and dominate essentially the wider Eurasian theater. The second thing I think is that broadly, Cold War, World War II, you really saw the Atlantic as the priority theater in the United States for a very long time. And so, yes, while the US had a lot of interest in Asia, has maintained those for a while, there was sort of an understanding for a long time that, Europe and NATO were primary. That has flipped today. And there is an open recognition that the Pacific is the primary theater of interest for the United States. And I think you have some folks in the current administration in the US who are essentially trying to argue that we should keep those theaters separate because you don't want to pull focus from the very real challenges the United States faces in Asia. I happen to agree that the Pacific needs to remain primary. I think we're just trying to say in our article that if you actually want to maintain deterrence, if you want to prevent economic coercion, if you want to create technological innovation, you do actually want to see Europe and Asia working more closely together.
Interesting. I'll go more to this whole debate about the reverse Nixon that never happened, or probably never happened. We'll discuss that later on. But this is interesting because in the piece you talk about this case whereby Elbridge Colby, for instance, tells the Europeans, no, 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 yeah, don't try to be heroes. Just take care of your own backyard, right? Just hold on to Russia, and then of course, let the Asians do. But so one way of looking at it is the U.S. will be kind of the master choreographer, whereby it makes sure key allies, frontline allies in each theater hold the revisionist force in that region honest. But the other way of also looking at it is actually allowing for more interface between US allies and of course between US and key allies here in a way that you have a coordinated fashion response to that. Is that a proper read? Because my read is that there is an agreement perhaps on the entwinement of these two theaters, but there's not exactly an agreement on tactically and operationally speaking, how are you most optimally going to respond to the rise of this new Sino-Russian alliance?
So I'm not sure, to be honest with you, that there is widespread agreement, maybe in the United States right now, about the entwinement between the two theaters. I think some folks see it that way. We talk in the article certainly about US allies in both Europe and Asia who have openly stated that they are concerned about that entwinement. But I think there is some debate, not just about tactics, but actually more broadly, how much is there connectivity between the two theaters? I think what we're trying to say is yes, you want European allies to primarily focus on Europe, and they definitely have a lot to do to catch up in their own self-defense capabilities. Yes, you want Asian allies to primarily focus on the very serious challenges we have in the Indo-Pacific. Totally agree with that. But it's not a zero-sum environment where that therefore means that we should discourage our allies in the two theaters from working together. And that's really the argument we're trying to make. That might seem common sense, but the reality is, I think we've seen in the last several months a really decreased demand signal from Washington for Asian allies to say anything or speak up or contribute in thinking about what's going on in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, and vice versa, as you mentioned, for European allies to be thinking about what they could do in Asia. And our argument is essentially that that is disadvantaging allies who, when you look at the implications of a both technologically and militarily more integrated China and Russia, will need to find ways to cooperate at a greater scale.
So maybe to simplify this further, we can talk about, the 50 shades of opinion on this particular issue. But what is the difference between your theory of the case, meaning the Biden administration, because you serve in senior positions both at the National Security Council and also at the Pentagon, and the Trump administration? Because, talking to senior folks in both administration, my understanding is that there is at least an agreement that Russia and China are coming closer together. But probably my read is that, it's closer than perhaps your read. But nevertheless, clearly I see divergence in terms of what to do with this reality. So,
Yeah.
from your perspective, what was the theory of the case as far as the Biden administration was concerned?
So I think a couple of things. At the simplest level, we thought that allied scale matters. Um, and that increasingly we needed not just allies sort of focusing on their own region, but bringing the diplomatic, the economic, and the military resources that they have to essentially surge to problem spots when you needed them. And so, certainly in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, and we talk about this, the Biden administration actively encouraged Indo-Pacific allies to think about what they might do, not just militarily, but even economically, to help support Ukraine. The flip side of that is in settings like NATO or in the G7, where you have more European partners, the Biden administration very actively worked to say, hey, we want European partners speaking up about Taiwan's security. We want European partners speaking up about the harassment that the Philippines is facing in the South China Sea. I think overall that was actually quite successful, and that for the first time, you saw partners in Asia and Europe paying much more attention to what was going on in other regions and looking for specific ways that they could collaborate more closely together. And when you look at, for example, harassment the Philippines has faced, having partners like France, like the UK, like Canada want to show up, not just militarily, but looking at trade agreements, looking at ways they could help if the Philippines was, suddenly in a situation where bananas are rotting on the dock again. What could Europe do to help? Those are meaningful things that if you just take an Asia only approach, you are sort of weakening your allies and what they can do in a moment of crisis.
Interesting. I mean, the reading of a lot of us in Asia was that we felt the Biden administration got Asia quite right. I mean, I'm sure there are folks who don't agree, but I felt it was a very sophisticated approach. The whole integrated deterrence, I think, was a realistic appreciation of a kind of a proper division of labor and also the scale and the size of China's rise. We felt that was really, really, really the right approach. And I think if you were China, you would be really worried about if you had the continuity in that kind of American foreign policy. The sense we get though is that when suddenly you have the conflict in Ukraine, then you have the October 7 terror attacks, and then the ensuing conflicts in the Middle East. It looked like the Biden administration was quite overwhelmed. Um, I mean, you're free to disagree with us, and again, we understand how difficult each of these issues we're talking about are. Uh, Nevertheless, was that because there was no kind of a unifying framework of analysis? Was it because there was an artificial differentiation that was no longer applicable? I mean, I probably am wondering about also your interagency, inter-region kind of coordination. I mean, realistically, was it really a difficult balancing act for you guys?
Um, Yeah, I mean, I guess I would maybe push back on the notion that the Biden administration was overwhelmed. Uh, but that doesn't mean it's not a difficult balancing act. It's absolutely a difficult balancing act. I think that is the reality for any US administration, and kind of the price of being a superpower is that balancing and prioritizing when, the world is on fire is incredibly difficult. But I would say when you look at, the last year or two of the Biden administration, the fact that you had folks simultaneously managing to rally unprecedented support for Ukraine at the same time as dealing with, the aftermath of the October 7th attacks and the war in Gaza, while simultaneously keeping up a pretty unprecedented pace of engagement in Asia. Just speaking from personal experience, I 5 days before the end of my job in the Biden administration was on a plane with Jake Sullivan headed to India, which was his final foreign trip. And I was in India with him within about 5 days of starting at the White House. So, the fact that all of that was going while you were actually managing two wars, I think is a pretty remarkable statement to the ability of the United States when we are at our best to actually juggle multiple things at the same time.
Now, I want to talk about the Trump administration and my region, Southeast Asia, more, but probably towards the latter part of this discussion. But of course, the meat of the discussion, obviously, here is the U.S. Sorry, is the Russia-China synergy
Yeah.
alliance, whatever you want to call them. For a lot of us, Asia watchers, we have always been very skeptical about this Russia-China dynamic. I mean, you don't have to be an expert in Cold War and know about, the whole thing that Nixon did back in the day, which was to exploit the fault lines between the Soviet Union and China. So you don't have to be an expert of Cold War to also understand that modern Russia always had insecurities vis-a-vis China, particularly because of the situation in Siberia. I remember conversation with Russians prior to their invasion of Ukraine in 2014 when we were still talking to them. They were not such a pariah. Was that they were always saying we fear China more than actually the West, right? Like these are really to them, this were the other, right? So there was always this kind of skepticism. Is this a tactical alliance, alliance of convenience? My reading of your analysis is that a growing number of top experts in the US believe that this is no longer just an alliance of convenience. Whether Putin intended it or not, more or less there is an entwinement in ways that is going to bind those two powers for the foreseeable future. I mean, what is your read? How real is this alliance, and what are the consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is there are natural reasons why China and Russia might not want to be as closely tied to each other. But when you look at where that relationship has gone in the last few years, I think it's hard to see it as anything except an alliance in name. And we can kind of all quibble about it, but you just need to look at the impacts that that relationship is having in both Europe and Asia. When you have, you know, Chinese technologies essentially helping to sustain Russia on the battlefield, when you have US officials talking, which we mentioned in the piece, about what the repayment for that looks like technologically in the future, and when you have Chinese and Russian officials basically saying nothing is off limits when it comes to this partnership, and we're going to do more in areas like space, in defense, and we're just going to integrate ourselves more. I mean, we can quibble about whether that's really an alliance, but I would just argue that the implications of that for everybody are going to be just the same as if, there was a formal sort of mutual defense treaty that everybody had signed in the way that we think about traditional alliances.
I get your point. Like functionally speaking, it is more or less.
Functionally speaking, it's more or less an alliance. And I think we don't really know what the implications of that will be long term. But especially as Russia becomes the essentially weaker, more junior partner here, I think maybe some of the ability that the two countries had in the past to keep their distance from each other because maybe it was a more equal power dynamic, that goes away, right? And so you potentially end up with countries that continue to become much more intertwined because Russia may not have the same ability to say no to China in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the junior partner part is important to me, right? Because my sense is, well, now Russia is in, dire straits. Obviously, they'll get whatever they can get out of China, but clearly they're also reaching out to India. India is also a major, major partner for them, not to mention North Korea, Iran, and other kind of countries, and some countries also in the global south. Um, but the junior partner part of this, do you believe that this is sustainable for, I don't want to use the term Russian pride, but I mean, I'm just having a hard time imagining the Russians will be happy about being a junior partner for the foreseeable future. Are you saying they're structurally locked into that? It's like they have crossed the Rubicon. Is that your reading of it?
In the near term, they are structurally locked into that. I mean, I'm not saying they like it, and I'm sure they'll, publicly front all the reasons why that's not true. But structurally, their economy and their defense industrial base has been eviscerated because of the war in Ukraine, and they have really limited diplomatic options. So where else are you going to go?
And you don't see this as a Putin thing.
In what sense do you mean?
Like if Putin were gone tomorrow or change his mind, don't you think that's not going to change the trajectory of this?
I, I mean, I guess we can speculate about that, but like I could speculate about what if Xi Jinping wasn't there? Sure, all bets are off, but I think for now, like we have Xi and we have Putin, and that's where we are.
Yeah, and those two gentlemen have met each other more than any other leader, right? They're almost the same age. It's like creepy, right? And like Xi Jinping loves reading Russian literature and about Russian history and all. I was like something really weird is going on between those two world leaders, or some would say autocrats and dictators. So now let's talk about the Trump administration, the latter part of this episode. Um, so we discussed the Biden administration. I saw you gently pushing back against some of the subtle
It was
criticisms.
friendly. It was friendly.
Yeah, friendly. Yeah, we're we're friendly with everyone here. Um, Trump administration. What is your read of this? Because some of us in our more fantastical mood said why not a reverse Nixon, right? And you know Trump and Putin schmoozing with each other kind of gave credence. I mean, you never know with Trump, right? It's like I mean, we were just watching him with the Syrian president, who was a wanted guy not long ago by U.S. authorities. It's like so what is your read of the Trump? Do you think the Trump administration has already developed a framework with dealing with this, what you call a Eurasian order, or you think they're still finding their way here?
They are still finding their way to an extent. I do think, we're all sort of waiting here in the United States to see when the new national defense strategy comes out, and lots of speculation, I think, about what that will entail. But I don't want to get ahead of it. I want to sort of see what they have to say and how they define their own strategy. So I would say just looking at how things appear operationally, at least. It looks like you're going towards something that is maybe a little bit more of almost a spheres of influence kind of approach, greater emphasis on what the United States is doing in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly, a greater emphasis on telling allies in both Europe and Asia, hey guys, you're going to sort of have to play a bigger role in managing what goes on in your region. Um, that's not entirely bad in the sense that, yeah, you want Asian allies to do more. You want European allies to do more. I guess the question is just, is that, is it enough? It's a necessary, but maybe not sufficient condition, is the way that I would describe it.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, our worry was a kind of a three emperor situation whereby, like the Chinese and Russian and Americans decide, okay, each of us will have a sphere of influence and, leave it there, right? I mean, that's why everyone is watching, Xi Jinping and Trump are going to mention Taiwan. Are they going to mention South China? So there's always that kind of fear at the back of people's, head, which is, Trump will cut a deal and essentially, each of these superpowers will carve out their sphere of influence. Which brings us really to the last, but in my opinion, very important part of this discussion because you put the GDPs of even two or three European countries together, it far outweighs Russia alone. So I always had questions with Russia being treated as a superpower, except they got a lot of nuclear warheads, sure. Um, but it's not like Europeans cannot step it up, right? If you look at their production possibility frontier in strategic terms, there's a lot they can go in Asia too. We see Japan beginning to step up. India is rising as a superpower in its own right. In Southeast Asia, you have large. I mean, China makes us look smaller, but we're not small. I mean, Philippines has as many people as Mexico. No one says Mexico is small, right? Vietnam is another big player. Indonesia has been already big. South Korea is stepping up. So what many people are saying from the outside, as far as the great power competition is concerned, is actually if this mid-sized allies and front line allies, not to mention other rising powers who are not necessarily with Team China or Team Russia, if they get their act together and probably coordinated it with Washington, even under Trump administration, then suddenly we are in a much more I don't want to use the word multipolar because it has been abused in many ways, but an indeterminate at the same time, strategically open scenario that perhaps could make things more interesting or even pluralistic. I mean, what is your read of that in terms of, do you think that the Trump administration is accelerating that scenario whereby these middle powers and frontal allies are stepping up and working together? Or you think that Trump's role, the so-called Trump shock, is exaggerated and we were moving towards that anyway? It's just that it's much more open and poignant now.
I think we were moving toward that anyways, but I also think the Trump administration is probably accelerating it. When we talk in the piece, you've had folks like European leaders in Indonesia and looking at and discussing trade agreements, just pretty openly saying like, hey, world feels kind of topsy-turvy right now, so we got to go find some new friends. So I think it's pretty overt that allies are sort of accelerating that kind of cooperation together, maybe as a result of uncertainty about the United States under the Trump administration. But to your earlier point, Richard, I think you're exactly right. When you look at the potential for allied scale, if you add up the countries working together, you win across every measure. The concern I think we have, and part of the reason we wrote this piece, was that you don't want to sort of disincentivize that at the exact moment that you ought to be leaning into that kind of cooperation. And I think the real risk for the United States is not just, well, maybe your allies are not cooperating as closely and that doesn't deter China and Russia as effectively. It's that what if your allies keep cooperating, but they are less interested in what DC thinks?
They move on. They move on.
Well, I mean, there are two things that I think happens. One, they keep cooperating, but maybe it happens in ways that don't fully align with US interests. Maybe in some ways, on some policy issues, I could look at tech and digital policy specifically. Allies could essentially say, actually, we don't like where US policy is, and we're going to go our own way. Alternately, they try to work together, but without the US actually bringing its market, its economy, its military to bear, it doesn't add up to enough, right? And so the US sitting on the sidelines has real risks for us. It has real risks for where that allied cooperation can go.
Yeah, I mean the sufficiency part will be lacking, right? So basically, what you're implying or basically arguing there is that you still need the U.S. as a coordinating agent here, because these allies couldn't put it together on their own terms or are not there yet, even if we both agree that they got the raw power or capital to be consequential in shaping the global order.
I think that I think that especially if we're talking about security issues, most people would probably honestly tell you it's hard to see who's coordinating that if the United States isn't there. And I think on some economic issues, I mean, just look at certain tech sectors. If you don't have the US as a part, it doesn't add up to as much. It just doesn't, right? Because the size and the advancement of the US economy in certain sort of sectors. So that's really the argument we're making, is that everybody loses if the United States sits this out.
Yeah, I think Rosh Doshi and Kurt Campbell had a fantastic piece. Was it in New York Times, whereby they really broke it down in key sectors, and that if it's just US versus China, US cannot do it, right? And it has to be US plus all of these key allies, and that's exactly where it's going to work. And I think that's where your administration, the Biden administration, was really, really, ahead of times, I would say, or at least catching up with time, which is this idea of strategic coordination with key allies in really, really cutting edge industries. And what was your read of that? That kind of I don't know, high fence, small yard approach. Do you think that that was showing enough promise, and that's something that should have been carried over to the? Because I'm still wondering, like, what is the Trump strategy here when it comes to semiconductors and some of these other critical technologies?
Yeah, I think it's not clear yet. You could look at some of the things that they're doing, maybe on how they're approaching, AI diffusion and exports, and say that maybe the approach is essentially like run faster. So we're not going to try to restrict any of it. We're just going to try to out innovate them. It's a different approach, I think, from the one the Biden administration was taking, which was, yes, out innovate them, but in certain sectors, we're just going to flat out restrict that technology. I would argue that I think, some of the signals we've seen out of the Chinese economy in the last few years suggest that that approach made sense. And I don't see why we should be making it easier for the Chinese military to continue making rapid advancements leveraging US technology. So, we can argue, and I guess at the end of the day, we'll wait a decade and we'll see which approach makes sense. But I think, quite frankly, that the approach the Biden
Do we
administration is
have a
taking.
decade? I mean, because some would say, maybe the Biden administration came a bit too late, or at most you could just have, postpone the inevitable by a matter of years or months. I mean, in terms of China catching up on the most high-grade semiconductors, among other things. I mean, what is your theory of the case?
I think slowing them down is absolutely the theory of the case,
To keep
right?
space, to give yourself
Yeah,
cushion. Yeah.
yeah, military and economically, that is exactly what you are doing. I don't think anyone is under any illusions that China is suddenly going to sort of be like, oh, you're right. We give up on AI innovation. We give up on thinking about how we reunify with Taiwan. That's not the goal, though. The goal is slow it down, make it harder, make it take longer. And so I think, the approach that essentially says, we'll just let them have the technology and, we just believe we can do it faster and better, is a real risk when we're talking about sort of edge and frontier technologies.
Or strategically fatalistic. But the idea is that you make something out of the time you're buying, right? To build up your
Absolutely.
your resilience, supply chain resiliency, etc.
That is right. Like we are extending the envelope and we are using that time to really build our own advantages.
And last part of discussion, I mean, I love grand strategy. It's amazing. But let's go really to your specialization, which is South and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Before we end on the Southeast Asia part, just very quickly, what is your read of this roller coaster situation as far as India-US relations is concerned?
Yeah, it certainly has been a roller coaster and one I would not have laid a bet that we would be on in this administration. My read is this. I think that probably sometime within the next several months, we will have a US-India trade deal. I think folks are working on that. I think we will figure that out. And once that deal happens, we will begin to return to something that looks functionally more normal in the US and India relationship. And I think that, Richard, because the US market is simply too important for India to not continue to work on this trade deal. And I think India is too important to the United States, for us to walk away. So I think we'll get there. But I do think there's lasting damage that
I
have been
was
done.
wondering about that. Yeah,
Yeah,
because
there
the
absolutely is.
Indian, their strategic imagination goes back to the Cold War period, how the US and Nixon stood by the other side, right?
Yeah, that's right. And honestly, we're like strategic mosquitoes in the United States. Like we just forget within 2 minutes. And Indian partners will be like, well, this is just like the Bay of Bengal all over again. And we'll be like, what happened in the Bay of Bengal? What are we talking about? Um,
Something worse
so
than Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean,
so I do worry that I think the trust that this scenario has eroded in Russia or in India and sort of the space it's given for the folks in India who think that Russia is a more reliable partner for the United States is something we're probably going to regret and we're going to be dealing with for the next few years.
and you're not too worried that China and Russia are in a position to exploit this temporary fault line, if that's the case.
I would answer that question differently. I am worried that Russia could exploit that fault line. Very worried about that possibility. Uh, I think that the China-India relationship has its own logic, right? And that there is an inherent ceiling to it because the situation along the border is not going away and is bad, and that's always going to temper what China and India can do together. In the exact same way in the Philippines, that as long as you have the situation in the South China Sea, it's only going to get so much better.
Which is a perfect segue to the final part of this discussion. I mean, very smooth, right? Thank you so much, Lindsay. This was fantastic. Let's talk about Southeast Asia. What is your theory of the case when it comes to American policy in Southeast Asia? I mean, like 90% at least of the commenters I see is extremely critical of the United States, including of the Biden administration. But at the same time, I feel like, okay, yes, the US was like, say, 7 out of 10, but it's not like China is really as benevolent and as, uh, you know, unambiguously charming as some people would say. In fact, I always this is a criticism I've had of many of my colleagues in Southeast Asia. It's like there's a lot of incentive to criticize the West because you know that sometimes if you bash them, they'll pay more attention to you. But if you bash the Chinese, like me, suddenly they're gonna revoke your visa if you're even if you're invited to the Boao Forum, right? Like there's always an asymmetry in terms of incentive, in terms of being honest. And I feel that sometimes like some of our colleagues in Southeast Asia are like, I'm not saying they're being dishonest. I'm just saying sometimes you're much more open about your reservations with the US compared to China. Because behind the scenes, when I talk to my fellow Southeast Asians, like, yeah, we don't want to be dominated by China too, but we have to tell these Americans not to sleep on their job. Like, but anyway, that's my reading of our, I would say, critical reading of the United States. Although we have some genuine disagreements with the United States, especially if you go to Malaysia, Indonesia, they have big disagreements with the Trump administration, even your administration, Biden administration, on the Gaza conflict issue and the U.S. response to the Israeli Palestinian conflict. But what is your theory of the case when it comes to U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia? Do you think the U.S. is generally getting it right, or you think it's really off the rails, or no, maybe it's not just appreciated enough?
Um, you know, I don't know that I could necessarily tell you in this administration thus far what their theory is the case is with Southeast Asia. I'm not really sure. And maybe to be fair to them, we're only in year one and they're still figuring out some bigger questions.
But this is like
Uh,
fifth year of Trump. Like like it's not the first year of Trump.
I would say this. I think fundamentally, what the US theory of the case is in Southeast Asia is we are there to provide options. That's it. We don't have territorial claims. We're not expecting every country in Southeast Asia to become an ally. We understand ASEAN and, the need for ASEAN consensus and the limitations that creates in some places. We're just there to create alternatives. And I think that at the end of the day, that's actually what Southeast Asian partners want. So yes, despite the criticisms about all the ways that we've fallen short and, we haven't done enough here and there. Um, I would personally argue that if you look at the last 70 to 80 years, the US has actually helped create alternatives and options in Southeast Asia. And if that is what we're doing, then we are broadly speaking getting it right, despite everything underneath that we can argue about. And there's no doubt that economically in particular, we haven't done a great job lately at providing as many economic alternatives as countries in Southeast Asia would like. But again, I think at the macro level, what we do is actually quite simple. For the Trump administration, I will say this. If you had asked me in January, as a longtime Southeast Asia expert, what would you say are the odds of President Trump going out for the ASEAN meetings? I mean, I would have laughed at you and said, like, less than zero. There's no way
It's Nobel
that,
Peace Prize element.
right? There's no way that's happening. Um, and when we knew he was going, if you'd asked me, like, were we going to see things come out of that meeting that I thought were broadly positive, I would have been like, probably not. So I will say that actually, I think the fact that he went, the fact that the United States did actually contribute in a constructive way to the Thailand-Cambodia situation. And that some of the things that are in those trade deals and frameworks that were negotiated, dealing with like transshipment and how you would handle export controls, that's way more than I frankly thought you'd ever see a country like Malaysia agree to. So I am going to, despite the fact that I'm not totally sure what the theory of the case is in Southeast Asia, I am going to give them credit that I think that there was more that was constructive out of that visit than I would have anticipated.
I mean, I completely agree with you, but I mean, I always felt, Trump has it in him, to pull off this rabbit out of the hat. And you just look at the dynamic he had with Anwar Ibrahim, right? Like Anwar Ibrahim, like every time he's with a Western leader, right? He's like berating them, whether it was in the ASEAN-Australia dialogue, whether it was with the German chancellor. But with Trump, I mean, it was like smooth, and it was like Trump has that magic. I'll give it that to him. There's really something about it. But I always say, it helps to be the president of a superpower. It gives you a lot of room for maneuver and antics, I would say. But to be selfish about it, I want to end on the part of the Philippines because I think
Yeah.
unlike much of Southeast Asia, we're not just looking for options, other options. Singaporeans would agree with you. Lee Kuan Yew was always talking about give us other options. But I think in the Philippines, we want more than just options. And I think just after the latest Squad meeting, which started under your administration in 2023, and now we're moving really, I think, towards the
That's my nickname, by the way, so thank you for using it.
exactly. I'll call you like Dr. Squad, right? This squad thing, and I ruffled a lot of feathers in India. I said, "This is the real quad." It's like this is the real one because at least these are countries with similar threat perceptions, at least to a certain degree. But I don't want to get into fight with our friends in New Delhi. No, but going back to the squad thing, I mean, now there's an agreement to create a special council. Next year, Australia and Japan are going to be full participants in the greatest sense of the word in the Balikatan exercises. So we're really moving by leaps and bounds in terms of the consolidation of this alliance. So much so that Eli was openly talking about why not a Pacific alliance or Asian NATO. So clearly in the Philippines, we want more than options. Now, what is your understanding of the direction of, I mean, again, kudos to your administration. You and Eli and the rest did fantastic job during the Marcos years. And I think we have come, you were talking about how surprised you were with Trump, pleasantly surprised. I would say many in the Philippines are so pleasantly surprised with Marcos' foreign policy, right? Everyone was fearful that we'll have kind of like Duterte 2.0. That didn't happen. But where do you think we are in terms of our alliance and relationship? And do you think maybe as some people like Eli have been arguing, like maybe the natural step is to go to the next level from the squad to really kind of a NATO style alliance. What is your read on that? As for and to connect it to your big discussion about
Yeah.
this Eurasian entwinement.
Mhm. Yeah, on a bilateral level, I frankly think that the US Philippines alliance is in one of the strongest places it's been in decades. Um, I am obviously biased, but I would argue that the progress that happened in the US Philippines relationship is one of the most important legacies that the Biden administration left in Asia. And also because it was very, I think, unexpected for a lot of people. But if you look at some of the things that we have in place, like ways that we can share information, the ways that we are exercising together, the integration of our troops, I mean, it is just this is not the sort of junior alliance where the Philippines maybe always felt overshadowed by like Japan and Australia anymore. This has become a much bigger, more real, more muscular alliance. And that is absolutely right. So I think we are in a great place. I think that overall, the Trump administration has maintained most of the policy work and a pretty steady pace of engagement with Manila. And I would say I am actually quite optimistic for the alliance, not just because of that, but because it has tremendous bipartisan support right now, where the US Congress agrees on like almost nothing. But there is real bipartisan support for Manila. So where that goes, I think there's a lot more that the squad can do. As you said, like it's a moment where threat perceptions are pretty aligned, but it's also a moment where like very sort of practical building blocks. Can we share information? Can Japanese troops actually show up to exercise in Manila? Those things are in place now in a way that they weren't in the past. And that just allows us to do a lot more together. So if I was going to quibble with Eli at all, and most of the time we agree on everything, I don't think that it is important or maybe even realistic to say that we would think of something like the squad in a more formal sense. But I also don't think we need to in order for those four countries to basically, in the same way that you see Russia and China doing this, just do the work together. Who cares what we call it? Who cares, what's written down on paper? We should just identify all of the functions that as allies we do together bilaterally and see if we can't start doing those multilaterally together.
Yeah, kind of a functional alliance, short of all potentially provocative fireworks. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is where honestly I think that the United States and allies like the Philippines ought to take a page from China, who sort of says like, oh, we don't have alliances, but then they go around and basically sort of like cherry pick all the things that they like out of alliances and try to get those anyways. why aren't we doing that more? Let's stop arguing about whether there should be a NATO and just like get to work. And let the work of what we're doing together as allies speak for itself. Manila's doing a lot of these things with European partners too. France, the UK, I think that's great. I would say the theory of the case for the Marcos administration seems to be that if we are not confident that maybe our friends in Southeast Asia are going to show up for us in the way we would like, then we need to have more friends. And it's great that a lot of those are in Asia, but I think it absolutely makes sense to look for some of those friends in Europe too.
Absolutely. The optimistic case here is like the Philippines becomes like a Poland, right? Not necessarily the exact frontline state. I mean, if Taiwan is, God forbid, going to be the Ukraine, the idea is that we want to be the Poland, right? You're just next in line. And from a country which was not so much of a factor, the Philippines is becoming a factor. And then we're taking a lot of inspiration from Poland. I mean, like the transformation in Poland is amazing. I mean, the economic miracle, the level of focus they have in their strategic thinking, the level of investment they have in their defense capabilities, the self-confidence of their top leaders, Sikorsky, obviously, among others, and the kind of strategic sophistication I saw from our conversation with our Polish counterpart gives us a lot of hope, plus the fact that the Philippines has like a four times more population than Poland, and the trajectory is there. Thank you so much, Lindsey, for that fantastic discussion. I know there's so much more we can discuss, and next year the Philippines will be the ASEAN chair, so hopefully we will continue this conversation more, perhaps in person or other platforms. But don't worry, I think precisely because the Philippines is going to be the ASEAN chair next year, we're going to do it more subtle. Like, so we're going to do the squad, but we're going to be a little bit more subtle. So you can imagine ASEAN meetings and then these massive balikatan exercises there and saying, oh, no, this is just routine, nothing special. So I think your version of the situation is perhaps going to be much more apparent in the coming year, and knowing the kind of I don't know, subtle statesmanship that Marcos Jr. also represents. On that note, thank you so much, Lindsey. Again, just to remind folks, what is your article, and why should people check it? Just kidding.
The article is the new Eurasian Order. It is in the latest Foreign Affairs. And if you really want to understand what the future of allied cooperation looks like across the world, you got to check it out.
Thank you. And Lisa, how can people follow you and your works?
You can find me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Okay, that sounds very very
I'm
professional.
I am otherwise a happy social media troglodyte.
I know. That's great. That's great. So thank you so much. And I'm sure your works are also available on the
On
ORF
the ORF
America.
website.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. Which is so we have to have Dhruva also on the show soon. Thank you so much, Lindsey. Have a lovely day and talk to you soon.
Great to talk to you, Richard. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.